There is a certain quiet that settles around a poker table. Chips move softly across the felt. Cards rest face down, waiting. For someone new to cash games, much of what matters is hidden in plain sight. The rules are simple, but the layers beneath them can feel endless. Tonight, we will move through the basics of cash game poker. We will look at the structure of the game, how to read the table, and which starting hands to play. We will talk about managing your bankroll, understanding pot odds, and the subtle art of bluffing. Along the way, you will hear how to adjust as other players change their style. Each idea builds on the last, making space for steady learning. The pressure in cash games is quiet, but constant. Every chip on the table has real weight. Time stretches out between decisions. There is no rush here. You can let your thoughts slow. The sounds and words will stay gentle and steady. Nothing will come suddenly. For now, you are here, and the pace is yours to keep. Chapter 1: The Starting Lineup. So let's just start with the game itself. Texas Hold'em is the most widely played form of poker in the world, and it's the best place to begin. The goal is straightforward. You're trying to win chips. You do that either by making the strongest 5-card hand at the end of the hand, or by getting everyone else to fold before it gets that far. Those are really the only two paths to winning any given hand, and every decision you make is aimed at one of those two outcomes. Each hand uses a standard 52-card deck. Every player at the table gets 2 private cards, and those belong only to them. Then, over the course of the hand, 5 more cards get placed face up in the middle of the table for everyone to share. Those are called community cards. You can use any combination of your 2 private cards and those 5 shared cards to build the best 5-card hand you can. That combination rule gives the game a lot of its depth, because sometimes the board cards help you a lot, and sometimes they help your opponents more. Now, before any cards even get dealt, there's a structure in place that determines who posts money and who acts in what order. This is where the dealer, small blind, and big blind come in. The dealer position, which gets marked by a small disc called the button, rotates 1 seat clockwise after every hand. The player sitting immediately to the left of the button posts the small blind. The player 1 more seat to the left posts the big blind. These are forced bets. They go into the pot before anyone sees their cards, and they exist to make sure there's always something worth playing for at the start of every hand. The betting rounds move in a specific sequence, and getting comfortable with that sequence is one of the first real things you need to lock in. It starts before the flop, which is why it's called pre-flop. Once everyone gets their 2 whole cards, the action begins with the player sitting to the left of the big blind. Each player going around the table chooses to fold, call the big blind amount, or raise. This continues until all remaining bets are matched and the action closes. Then comes the flop. The dealer places 3 community cards face up in the middle of the table. This is the first time the shared cards are visible, and they can change everything about how strong your hand feels. After those 3 cards appear, there's another betting round. This time, the action starts with the first active player to the left of the button, and that pattern holds for every street from here on out. After the flop betting settles, the dealer puts out a 4th community card. That's the turn. Another betting round follows. Then comes the 5th and final community card, which is called the river. One more betting round after that, and if more than one player is still in the hand, you move to a showdown. That's when everyone left reveals their cards, and the best hand wins the pot. Understanding the order of those streets, pre-flop, flop, turn, river, is essential. The action and information you gain at each stage builds on what came before it, and knowing where you are in the hand at all times keeps your decision-making grounded. Now let's talk about the two main formats you'll encounter as you start playing. Cash games and tournaments feel different enough that it's worth understanding what separates them before you ever sit down. In a cash game, the chips on the table represent real money directly. If you're playing a game where the small blind is $1 and the big blind is $2, those numbers mean exactly what they sound like. You buy in for a certain amount within the limits the table allows, and every chip in front of you has a straightforward dollar value. The blinds in a cash game don't change. They stay fixed for as long as you're playing. That stability affects the rhythm of the game in an important way, because the pressure to accumulate chips before the blinds eat your stack simply doesn't exist. You also have the freedom to leave whenever you want. If you've been playing for a couple of hours and you decide you're done, you pick up your chips, cash them out, and you walk away with whatever you've won or lost. That flexibility is one of the things that makes cash games feel more manageable for newer players. There's no clock, no escalating stakes, no fixed endpoint. You play as long as you want to play. Tournaments work quite differently. When you buy into a tournament, you receive a fixed starting stack of chips, and that's what you have to work with. You can't pull more money out of your pocket and add to your stack if things go badly. Once your chips are gone, you're eliminated. The goal shifts from simply winning money, hand by hand, to outlasting every other player at the event. The other major difference is that tournament blinds increase on a set schedule. Every round, the cost to play a hand goes up. Early in a tournament, the blinds might be small relative to your stack, so you have plenty of room to be selective. But as time goes on, the pressure builds. You eventually reach a point where you have to take more risks just to survive. That changes how decisions feel, because every chip you lose matters more when you can't get them back. For someone just starting out, understanding which format you're sitting down to play is foundational. The same situation at the table can call for a different response depending on whether you're in a cash game or a tournament, and that distinction runs through a lot of what comes later. Let's slow down now and go through the vocabulary. These are the words you'll hear constantly at the table, and being fluent in them makes everything else easier to absorb. The pot is the total amount of money in play during a given hand. Every bet, call, and raise goes into the pot, and the pot is what the winner collects at the end of the hand. When people talk about pot odds or pot size, they're referring to this accumulated pile. To call means you match the current bet. If someone raises to $10 and you want to stay in the hand without raising yourself, you put $10 in and you call. It keeps you in the action without increasing the pressure. To raise means you increase the size of the current bet. If the big blind is $2 and you decide to raise, you're putting in more than $2 and forcing everyone else to respond to a larger amount. Raising is a tool you use to build pots, to narrow the field, or to apply pressure on your opponents. To check is an option you have when nobody has bet yet in the current round. Instead of betting, you pass the action to the next player. It costs you nothing, and it keeps you in the hand. You can only check when no bet is facing you. To fold is to give up your hand. You throw your cards away, you're out of the hand, and you have no more claim to whatever is in the pot. Folding when you're beat is a necessary skill, not a failure. Going all in means you're putting your entire chip stack into the pot. It can happen in many situations, from big value spots to desperate moments late in a tournament. When you go all in, you can't be forced out of the hand by further betting. If someone has more chips than you and raises beyond what you have, You're only eligible to win a portion of the pot, up to the amount you put in. The showdown is what happens when the river betting is complete, and more than one player is still in the hand. Each remaining player turns over their whole cards, and the best 5-card combination wins. Showdowns don't happen every hand. Many hands end earlier, when everyone folds to a bet. But when they do happen, the showdown is the final verdict. That vocabulary is the common language of the game. You'll hear those words dozens of times every session, and knowing exactly what they mean lets you keep up with the action without hesitation. There's something worth sitting with for a moment, before moving forward. Poker isn't a game you master in one sitting. The rules themselves aren't complicated. You can pick up the structure of Texas Hold'em in an afternoon. But knowing the rules and knowing how to play are two very different things. What you're building right now is the foundation, and a solid foundation makes every concept that comes later easier to understand and easier to use. The game will make more sense each time you come back to it. The positions will start to feel natural. The betting rounds will have a rhythm. The vocabulary will stop being something you have to think about and start being something you just know. That's where you want to get to, and it comes through repetition and attention, not through rushing. Keep the objective simple for now. Win chips by making the best hand or getting others to fold. Everything else grows from there. Chapter 2. Reading the table. Sit down at any table, and you're stepping into something that's already alive. The energy's already moving before you even post your blind. Players have been picking up patterns on each other, adjusting, reacting, settling into rhythms. And whether you realize it or not, you're becoming part of that rhythm the moment you sit. That living quality of the table is what we're talking about when we say table dynamics. It's the overall flow of the game, shaped by how everyone at the table is playing, how they're reacting to each other, and what kind of atmosphere those interactions create over time. Every table is a little bit different, and no two sessions feel quite the same, even in the same game with the same stakes. A few things feed into that flow. The first is player behavior. That means how often someone's entering pots, whether they're raising frequently or just limping in, whether they seem patient or like they're itching to get involved every hand. Those behavioral patterns start to add up quickly, and they tell you something real about how that person approaches the game. Position plays into it too. Players who are sitting in early positions tend to play a bit more carefully because they'll be first to act on most streets, and that puts them at a disadvantage. You'll notice over time that the pots most often heated up by aggressive action tend to come from players in late position, where they've got more information before they have to commit. That's not a coincidence, and it shapes the texture of the table in a quiet but consistent way. Then there's aggression level and bet sizing. A table where most players are checking and calling feels entirely different from one where there's always a raise and a 3-bet before the flop even gets dealt. Bet sizes tell you how confident someone feels, or at least how they want to appear. And when you start noticing whether the raises are big and polarizing or small and probing, you're starting to read the table rather than just sitting at it. Something worth keeping in mind is that larger tables tend to run a little cooler. When there are more players sitting, people generally tighten up a bit, the pots stay smaller on average, and things move more conservatively. Shorter tables tend to run hotter. With fewer players, the ranges widen, the aggression picks up, and the whole dynamic shifts toward more action and more volatility. Neither is inherently better. They're just different environments that call for different adjustments. What makes this all meaningful is that it changes. The dynamics you're seeing at the start of your session may look completely different 2 hours later. A player who sat down quiet and tight might have taken a couple of bad beats and is now playing every hand out of frustration. Someone new might sit to your left, who bets every time they're checked to. A loose player might quit and get replaced by someone who hasn't played a hand in 40 minutes. Every one of those moments is a shift, and if you're not noticing it, you're falling behind. Staying observant isn't just about watching the cards. It's about watching the people. And the more clearly you can see who's sitting at your table and how they're actually playing, the more control you have over how you respond to them. Start by watching how often players get involved. Some players seem to play most of the hands dealt to them. Others sit back and wait a long time before entering a pot. That distinction between loose and tight is one of the first and most useful things you can identify. A loose player is getting into a lot of pots, playing a wide range of starting hands, and often chasing situations where a tighter player would simply fold. Tight players are more selective. They're waiting for stronger holdings before they commit, and when they do play, it usually means something. The second axis to pay attention to is how they play once they're in a hand. An aggressive player raises and bets more than they call. They're applying pressure, forcing decisions, making it expensive for you to stay involved. A passive player tends to call and check more than they bet and raise. They're reactive rather than initiative-taking. The combinations of these two axes give you 4 basic categories: tight and aggressive, tight and passive, loose and aggressive, loose and passive. Each one creates a recognizable pattern, and each one responds to different approaches. The signs that point you toward these categories are usually pretty visible if you're watching. Bet sizing is one of the clearest. Someone who consistently makes large bets relative to the pot is usually trying to pressure and charge you for staying in. Someone who bets small or limps often is likely more passive, testing the water rather than committing. Raise frequency is another. How often does this player 3-bet before the flop? How often do they lead out on the flop after calling a raise? These aren't things you can measure precisely in the moment, but you pick up the feel for it after a few orbits. Watching how players take their hands to showdown teaches you a lot too. What did they show up with after all that betting? Was it a strong hand, or were they pushing thin value and semi-bluffs? Were they calling down with middle pair? Once you see what someone's willing to go to showdown with, you've got a much sharper picture of how they think about hand strength. Keep in mind that none of these categories are permanent. The player who was playing tight for the first hour may open up after winning a big pot. Someone who was running over the table might hit a cold stretch and shift into survival mode. That's why ongoing observation matters more than early labeling. You're not trying to pin someone down once and rely on that forever. You're continuously updating your picture of them as the session goes on. Now the question is what to do with all of this. Observation without application is just entertainment. The whole reason you're paying attention is to make better decisions with your own hands. Against passive opponents, you can generally widen the range of hands you're willing to play. If someone's going to call your bets down, without raising and without putting a lot of pressure back on you, you have more room to build pots and extract value. They're not going to make you pay for speculative holdings as often, so it becomes worthwhile to get involved in more spots against them. They're also less likely to bluff you off the best hand, which makes calling with marginal holdings slightly more reasonable. Against players who are loose and aggressive, and especially when you're out of position relative to them, it tends to pay to tighten up. Playing a wide range of hands out of position against someone who's going to raise and continue to apply pressure puts you in a series of difficult spots. The tough decisions pile up. Your edges with marginal hands evaporate quickly because they're pushing you off them or extracting chips when you don't know where you stand. Narrowing your range in those spots, and only getting involved with holdings you feel confident about, is a way of avoiding exactly the situations where you're most likely to make expensive mistakes. Your position at the table is a tool you can actively use. When you're acting late, and the players still to act after you are passive or predictable, widening your range and applying pressure starts to make a lot of sense. You already have the informational advantage of acting after them on most streets. If they're also unlikely to fight back hard, you can lean into that even more. The combination of position and a predictable opponent in front of you is one of the more exploitable situations available in a cash game. It helps to pick one player and really focus on them for a stretch of time, rather than trying to track everyone at once. If you can tune into one person's pot involvement and raise frequency over several orbits, you start to develop a reliable feel for how they're playing right now. That targeted observation guides the real-time adjustments that actually show up in your results. When they enter the next pot, you've already got context. All of this is really about building an accurate picture of your environment. The more clearly you see it, the more choices you have. You can avoid leaking chips against players who are dangerous in certain spots. You can identify the players who are likely to give action without much resistance. You can time your adjustments to match shifts in the table, rather than always reacting a step too late. None of it requires certainty. You're working with tendencies and likelihoods, not guarantees. A tight player can still show up with a bluff. A passive player can suddenly wake up with a big hand. The goal isn't to predict every outcome. It's to make decisions that are better calibrated to the reality in front of you than they would be if you were playing in a vacuum. Long-term success in cash games is built on this kind of steady attention. Not just to your own cards, but to everything else that's happening at the table. The player who's always watching, always updating, and always willing to shift when the situation calls for it, has a quiet advantage that compounds over time. The game rewards that kind of patience and awareness, even when individual hands don't go the way you'd expect. So when you sit down, take a breath, and look around. The cards will come soon enough. Chapter 3: Starting Hands Strategy. Starting hand selection is one of those things that separates players who lose money slowly from players who start winning. It's not glamorous. It doesn't feel like the most exciting part of the game. But the hands you choose to play before the flop shape every decision that comes after. There are 1,326 distinct two-card starting hand combinations in Texas Hold'em. That's a lot of possible situations. Not all of them deserve your chips. Learning to sort through them with some discipline is what this is really about. When you think about why certain hands are worth playing, it usually comes down to a few things. The rank of your cards matters. The suitedness of your cards matters. And how well those two cards work together matters a lot. High card ranks give you a better chance of making top pair, or better when the flop comes out. If you're holding cards with strong kickers, you're more likely to be in good shape, even when your pair gets called. Weaker kickers on ace-high hands tend to create spots where you make the same pair as your opponent, but lose anyway, because their kicker beats yours. Over many hands, those situations quietly drain your stack. Suitedness adds another layer of value. Suited hands can make flushes, and even when they don't, the flush potential quietly boosts how well they perform over time. It's not that every suited hand is automatically good. It's that suited hands generally carry more playability than their offsuit versions, and that edge compounds across sessions. Pocket pairs are their own category. They don't necessarily have the highest raw strength, but they carry something called set mining potential. When you hold a pocket pair and flop a set, which is three of a kind using your pocket pair plus a matching board card, you often have a very strong hand that's disguised and difficult to play against. That makes even smaller pocket pairs worth considering in the right situations. The chance of being dealt any pocket pair at all is roughly 5.88%, so they don't come around constantly. When they do, understanding their value helps you make better decisions with them. At the top of the hand strength hierarchy, premium pairs and big suited connectors tend to form the core of any solid starting hand selection. They offer raw equity advantages, meaning they're more likely to be ahead of opponents' ranges before the flop even begins. That's a useful place to start. But hand value isn't completely fixed. What a hand is worth shifts depending on how many players are in the pot, what the effective stack sizes are, and what the general mood of the table is. A hand that's clearly worth playing in one environment might be marginal in another. Thinking about both raw strength and flexibility gives you a more complete picture before you put chips in. Position is probably the single most important contextual factor in starting hand selection. Where you sit relative to the dealer button determines whether you act early or late in the betting round, and that order of action has a real effect on which hands are worth playing. When you're in early position, you're acting before most of the table. You don't know yet what everyone else is going to do. Some of them might have strong hands. Some might be planning to raise. Because you're making decisions without that information, you need to be more selective. Early position generally calls for narrower starting hand ranges. You're essentially asking your hand to carry more weight on its own, because you can't lean on the information that would come from watching others act first. Late position flips that around. By the time the action reaches you in a late seat, you've already seen what several players have done. You know if someone raised. You know if the table is quiet. That information has real value because it tells you something about the strength of hands that are already in the pot. It lets you widen your starting hand range in a reasonable way because your decisions are more informed. You're not guessing as much. The button is the best seat at the table for this reason. On every street after the flop, you act last against the remaining players. That control lets you support the widest pre-flop starting hand ranges of any position. You're acting last against the fewest players, which means you have the most information and the most flexibility with how you navigate the hand. Playing out of position, meaning you'll be acting before your opponents on most streets, generally requires stronger starting hands to compensate for that disadvantage. The informational deficit you face when you have to act first on every street is real, and over many sessions it adds up. One way players manage this is by adjusting raise sizes based on position. Opening with a slightly larger raise from early position can help balance the fact that you're at an informational disadvantage. It's a way of using bet sizing as a tool to shape the field you're entering the hand against. The key takeaway is that position is not just a nice bonus. It's a structural feature of the game that should directly influence which hands you choose to play and how confidently you play them. Table context is where starting hand selection stops being a fixed formula and becomes something more alive. You can't just decide on a list of hands to play and stick to it, regardless of what's happening around you. The table tells you things, and adjusting to what it tells you is part of playing well. Player tendencies are one of the clearest signals. If you're sitting at a table where most players are playing tightly, folding a lot, and only entering pots with strong hands, that creates an opportunity. When most of the table is folding, there are fewer players competing for the pot, and you can widen your range somewhat. You're not up against as many strong hands, so hands that might be marginal in a tougher spot become more viable. The opposite is also true. When the table is loose, and players are entering pots with a wide variety of hands, the pots tend to get bigger and messier. Multi-way pots, meaning 3 or more players seeing the flop, change what kinds of hands do well. In those environments, tightening up tends to be the more profitable approach. You want to be entering those pots with hands that have genuine strength, because you're going to be up against more players and more combinations working against you. Aggressive opponents deserve specific attention. When there's a player at your table who raises frequently, 3-bets often, and generally puts pressure on the action, entering pots against them with marginal hands tends to create difficult situations you don't need to be in. Against aggressive players, tightening your starting hand range pre-flop is a reasonable response. You're not giving up equity by folding weak hands against aggression. You're protecting yourself from spots where you'd be out of position or out of depth with a hand that can't handle the heat. Passive opponents work differently. A player who tends to call rather than raise, who doesn't put in a lot of pressure, and who checks a lot, gives you more room to maneuver. You don't need to be as selective against passivity, because the decisions after the flop tend to be more manageable. You'll often have a clearer sense of where you stand. Game flow is a subtler thing to track, but it matters. Recent action patterns affect the feel of the table. If there have been several big pots in a row, players might be tilted, or they might be playing more cautiously to protect their stacks. Stack depths shift the value of certain hand types. Deeper stacks increase the value of hands that can make big disguised hands like sets or flushes, because there's more money to win when you connect. Shorter stacks reduce that implied value, because there's less money to extract, even when you hit. There are roughly 6 combinations of any specific pocket pair in the deck, and pocket pairs arrive at roughly a 5.88% rate. That means most of the time you're being dealt 2 unpaired cards and making judgment calls about whether they're worth playing. Tracking the flow of the game helps you make those calls with better information. If the action has been aggressive and the stacks are shallow, you're in a different situation than if the game is calm and everyone is sitting deep. The practice of observing your opponents before you act pre-flop isn't just about picking up reads on their current hands. It's about building a model of how they play. That model updates in real time. Someone who was playing tight an hour ago might be running loose now because they lost a few pots. Someone who seemed passive might be starting to 3-bet more frequently. Staying aware of those shifts lets you adjust your starting hand selection dynamically rather than operating from a static plan. Tight and loose starting hand approaches each have a place depending on the environment. Tight play means you're entering fewer pots, playing mostly strong hands, and reducing the number of marginal situations you face. Loose play means you're entering more pots, accepting more variance, and relying on your ability to outplay opponents after the flop to make up for weaker starting hand strength. Neither approach is universally correct. A tight strategy tends to be more forgiving when you're still developing your skills, because it filters out a lot of the difficult spots that come with marginal hands. It's easier to navigate a hand you entered with a strong starting holding than one you entered with a speculative holding that didn't quite connect. At the same time, playing too tightly at a passive table leaves money on the table you could have won. A looser approach can be effective when you have positional advantages, when you have a strong read on your opponents, or when the table environment genuinely rewards speculative play. But it requires more skill to execute profitably. You're putting yourself in more uncertain spots more often, and the ability to adjust and outplay opponents after the flop becomes more important. The honest answer is that most successful cash game players operate somewhere in between, and they move along that spectrum based on what the table is telling them. They don't commit to one mode permanently. They start with a baseline, observe the environment, and shift as the game develops. Starting hand selection is not a skill you finish learning. It's something you keep refining as you gain experience. The more hands you play, the better you get at recognizing which situations favor which types of hands. You start to feel the difference between a spot where a suited connector has real value and a spot where it's just a way to bleed chips. You develop a cleaner sense of when position is giving you enough information to loosen up, versus when you should hold tight regardless of what the table looks like. What you're building over time is judgment. The facts and frameworks give you a foundation. Position matters. Raw hand strength matters. Suitedness and connectivity add playability. Opponent tendencies shape how you apply all of that. But judgment is what ties those things together in real time, when you're sitting at the table and the action is on you. The decisions that happen before the flop set the trajectory of the whole hand. They determine how difficult or manageable the rest of the hand will be. Getting those decisions more right, more consistently, is one of the most reliable ways to improve your overall results. It's quiet work. It doesn't always announce itself, but it shows up in the long run. Chapter 4: Managing Your Bankroll. There's a side of poker that never shows up in the hand histories. You won't see it on the felt, but it quietly determines whether you're still playing 6 months from now, or whether you burned out after a few rough weekends. It's the system you build around your money before you ever sit down. The basic idea is straightforward. Poker bankroll management is the practice of setting aside a specific pool of money that's only for poker. Not rent. Not groceries. Not your emergency fund. Just poker. That pool sits on its own, and you treat it like its own thing, separate from everything else in your financial life. The reason that separation matters so much is that poker has variance. You can play well and still lose. You can make all the right decisions and still leave a session down. When your poker money is mixed in with your everyday finances, a losing session doesn't just feel bad at the table. It starts bleeding into real life. You start thinking about what that loss meant for your budget, and that pressure follows you back to the next session. Keeping the funds separate protects your essential money, and it also protects your thinking. When you know your poker bankroll can absorb some losses without touching the rest of your life, something shifts mentally. The decisions you make at the table become a little cleaner. You're not playing scared. You're not calculating whether you can afford to call. You're just playing poker. That psychological cushion is one of the quiet advantages that experienced players carry with them, and it's one of the reasons consistent bankroll discipline tends to show up again and again when long-term players talk about what's kept them in the game. The next piece of this is understanding limits, and specifically what it means to set them before a session starts, rather than during one. When you decide in advance how much of your bankroll is on the line for a given session, you're making a calm, rational decision. When you try to make that decision in the middle of a losing stretch, you're making it under pressure. Those are two very different mental states, and they tend to produce very different outcomes. Your session limits and your stake selection should both be tied to the size of your bankroll, not to how you're feeling that day. The general approach is to treat your stake level as something you've earned the right to play by having a meaningful number of buy-ins behind you. That multiple of buy-ins acts like a buffer. It means one bad session, or even a string of them, doesn't wipe you out. It keeps you in the game long enough for your decisions to matter. Think about what happens when the buffer is too thin. You sit down at a stake where losing 2 or 3 sessions would take a serious chunk of your bankroll. Now every hand carries more weight than it should. You might avoid certain plays because you can't afford the risk, even when the play would be correct. You might stay in bad spots because you're hoping to get back to even before the session ends. Those aren't poker decisions. Those are fear decisions. And the limits you set in advance are what prevent you from getting into that situation in the first place. Consistency is what turns those limits into something real. It's not enough to decide on a number and then quietly let it slide when things get interesting. Sticking to what you set beforehand, even when it's uncomfortable, is what gives those limits their actual protective value. Over many sessions, the players who stay consistent with their limits tend to avoid the kind of sudden severe losses that push people out of the game entirely. Now let's talk about the mistakes, because they're common and they follow recognizable patterns. The most frequent one is chasing losses. You've had a rough session. You're down a meaningful amount. The instinct says that if you just keep playing, you can get it back. So you stay longer than you planned. Maybe you move to a bigger game. Maybe you start taking spots you normally wouldn't. The problem is that none of that changes the underlying math or improves your decision-making. It usually makes both worse. Chasing losses is one of the fastest ways to deplete a bankroll because it turns a manageable loss into a much larger one. The second major pitfall is moving up in stakes too quickly. This one can feel justified in the moment because it's often triggered by a winning streak. You've been running well at your current level, and the next level up looks appealing. The issue is that a bigger game means bigger swings. If your bankroll isn't deep enough to absorb those swings, a normal downswing at the new level can do serious damage. Moving up should be something that happens because your bankroll has grown to support it, not because you're confident after a good week. Both of these mistakes share the same root cause. They're emotional responses dressed up as strategy. Chasing losses feels like determination. Moving up too fast feels like progress. But underneath both of them is a player reacting to feelings rather than managing a plan. The discipline required to avoid these patterns is built through habits, and the most useful habit is tracking your results. This doesn't have to be complicated. Just keep a record of your sessions, what stakes you played, how long you played, and what the outcome was. Over time, that record tells you things you can't see in the moment. You'll start to notice patterns in when you tend to lose more than expected. You'll see whether certain session lengths lead to worse decisions. You'll have actual data to look at, instead of just a feeling about how things are going. Going back through your decisions regularly works alongside that. When you review a session, you're not looking for ways to feel bad about your losses. You're looking for decisions that didn't fit your plan, spots where emotion crept in, or times when you ignored a limit you'd set. That kind of review keeps you honest, and it makes the lessons from each session portable. You carry them forward instead of just moving on. The goal underneath all of this is longevity. Cash games reward players who are still there, still thinking clearly, still making good decisions over a long stretch of time. Every tool in bankroll management points back toward that. The separate fund keeps your thinking clean. The limits protect against catastrophic sessions. The tracking and reviewing close the feedback loop, so you keep getting better. The discipline to stay consistent is what holds everything together when it gets hard. There's no shortcut version of this. You can be technically skilled at the game and still undermine yourself by ignoring the financial structure around it. The players who last tend to be the ones who took the management side as seriously as the strategy side, treating it not as a restriction, but as the foundation that lets everything else work. Some nights you're going to leave a session down and wonder whether the limits you followed were worth it. On those nights, the answer isn't visible yet. It shows up across dozens of sessions, in the fact that you're still playing, still learning, still in a position to improve. That's what the discipline is protecting. Chapter 5. Understanding pot odds. There's a moment at the table where someone bets into you and everything gets quiet. You've got a hand that's not there yet, but it could get there. And you're sitting with a decision in front of you that has a right answer. Not a guess. An actual right answer. The goal is learning how to find it. That starts with understanding what's in the pot and what it costs you to stay in the hand. Pot odds are just a comparison. You're looking at how much money is already out there waiting to be won, and you're weighing that against what it costs you to keep playing. That relationship tells you the minimum amount of the time you'd need to win just to break even on the call. Nothing more complicated than that. It's a way of measuring whether the price you're being asked to pay is fair, given the size of the reward. Here's how to actually run the number. Say there's some amount of money in the pot, and your opponent fires a bet at you. You take the current pot size, you add the bet, and then you add the amount you'd have to call. That gives you the total pot after your call goes in. Then you divide just your call amount by that total. Multiply by 100, and you've got your pot odds as a percentage. That percentage is telling you the minimum share of the time you need to win this hand for the call to be worth making. So if the pot holds $100 and someone bets $50 at you, you'd call 50 to win a pot that becomes 200 total. 50 divided by 200 is 1/4. That's 25%. You need to win this pot at least 25% of the time for the call to pay off in the long run. If you're going to win it more often than that, the call starts pulling in a profit over time. If you're winning it less often, you're losing money on average every time you make that call. Some players find the ratio version a little easier to picture. Instead of dividing the call by the total pot, you just compare the pot size to what you have to call. If there's 150 in the pot, and it costs you 50 to call, that's 3-to-1. For every 1 unit you put in, you're getting 3 back if you win. The ratio format is useful for quick mental comparisons, but the percentage approach ties directly into how we think about equity, so that tends to be more useful when you're making the full calculation. One thing worth being careful about. When you're calculating pot odds, you count what you can win from the pot, not including your own call. Your call amount is the cost. The pot is the reward. You divide the cost by the total after the call goes in. That keeps the math clean and honest. The other useful thing about common bet sizes is that they produce the same pot odds percentage every time, regardless of how big the pot is. When someone bets half the pot, that always works out to the same break-even requirement. When someone bets the full pot, that always produces the same number too. Knowing those standard outputs by heart saves time at the table. A quarter pot bet, a half pot bet, a full pot bet, a 2 times pot shove. They each carry their own built-in percentage. You can practice with those specific sizes until the numbers feel automatic. Now, knowing your pot odds is only half of what you need. The other half is knowing your equity. And to connect those two things, you need a way of measuring what each decision is actually worth over time. That's where expected value comes in. Expected value is what you can expect a decision to earn or cost you on average if you repeat it across many, many situations. It's the long-run result of a choice. Poker isn't one decision. It's thousands of decisions made under similar conditions across your lifetime of playing. Expected value is how you measure whether those decisions are building up profit or bleeding you dry. The way expected value works is straightforward. You multiply the probability of winning by the amount you'd win. Then you multiply the probability of losing by the amount you'd lose. Subtract the second from the first, and that's your expected value for that decision. If it's a positive number, the decision earns money on average. If it's a negative number, the decision costs money on average. And over enough repetitions, those averages become your actual results. A call can be correct and still lose in the short term. That's the part that takes some getting used to. If you're winning the pot 40% of the time, but only needed to win it 25% of the time to break even, you're making money on that call in the long run, even when you miss. The individual outcome doesn't change the math. What matters is whether the decision itself had positive expected value when you made it. The cards fall where they fall. Your job is to keep putting yourself in situations where the math is working in your favor. Expected value and pot odds work together because they're measuring the same thing from slightly different angles. Pot odds tell you what percentage of the time you need to win. Your equity tells you what percentage of the time you actually expect to win. When your equity is higher than your pot odds requirement, the call has positive expected value. When it's lower, the call has negative expected value. The decision itself comes down to that comparison. A call becomes mathematically sound when the equity you hold in the hand exceeds the break-even threshold created by the pot odds. The gap between those two numbers is where your edge lives. A small gap means a close call, not much profit. A large gap means a clear call with real long-term value attached to it. And on the other side, when your equity falls well short of the break-even number, you're looking at a fold regardless of how much you'd like to stay in the hand. Equity is your share of the pot in the long run. It's the probability that your hand wins or ties by the time the hand reaches showdown, measured against whatever range your opponent is likely holding. It's not a guarantee of winning this specific hand. It's a mathematical claim on a portion of the pot, based on how often your hand figures to come out ahead. If you hold 40% equity in a pot, that means across a large sample of identical situations, you'd expect to win approximately 40% of those pots. To make a well-grounded decision, you compare those two numbers directly. First, you calculate what the pot odds are asking of you, which is the break-even equity percentage. Then you estimate your actual equity in the hand. If your equity clears that break-even threshold, the call is likely profitable over time. If it doesn't, you're better off saving the chips. The practical challenge is that you're doing this in real time, usually under some time pressure, without a calculator. That's why the goal isn't perfect math every single time. The goal is getting close enough, fast enough, that your decisions are consistently tilting toward positive expected value, rather than away from it. Accuracy improves with repetition. The more you practice the calculations away from the table, the faster and more instinctive they become when you're actually sitting in a hand. A useful way to build that instinct is to work through the numbers after sessions or while watching hands play out. Take a pot size, add a bet, work out the break-even percentage. Do it over and over until you're not counting on your fingers anymore. When a 50% pot bet always produces roughly the same break-even number in your head before you've even thought about it, you've built a real tool you can use in real situations. The other side of this is recognizing when the math is telling you something you might not want to hear. If your pot odds say you need 33% equity to break even, and your honest read of the situation is that you're closer to 20%, the call is losing money. It might feel like the right play in the moment. You might really want to catch the card you need. But expected value doesn't care about what you want. It rewards decisions that are correct relative to the numbers, not decisions that feel exciting or hopeful. Folding in a spot where the math doesn't support calling is a form of winning. You're preserving chips that would have been lost on a call with negative expected value. Over a long session or a long career, those saved chips add up just like one chips do. The discipline to fold when the math says fold is one of the quieter but more important habits you can develop. And on the flip side, finding a spot where the pot is offering you far better odds than your hand actually needs is where real value hides. Those are the moments where you're getting paid to make a call. Your equity exceeds the break-even line by a healthy margin, and if you run into that situation enough times and always take it, the profit accumulates quietly in the background. The process itself is worth stating clearly because it forms the backbone of sound cash game thinking. You see a bet. You add the pot, the bet, and your call to find the total. You divide your call by that total and multiply by 100. That's your break-even equity requirement. Then you estimate your actual equity as honestly as you can. You compare the two. If your equity is above the requirement, the call tends to have positive expected value. If it's below, the call tends to work against you over time. That's the loop. It's the same loop every time. The inputs change, but the process stays constant. And the more times you run through it, both in practice and at the table, the more it starts to feel less like a math problem and more like a reflex. Building that reflex is the real work. You can understand the concept in a single sitting. Turning it into something automatic requires returning to it again and again, in different pot sizes, different bet sizes, different equity estimates. Start with the standard bet sizes, since those repeat constantly in cash games. Know what each one demands in terms of break-even equity. Then practice estimating equity in different types of situations until your estimates start feeling grounded rather than arbitrary. Over time, you'll notice that a lot of decisions stop feeling ambiguous. You'll know fairly quickly whether the math is close or clear. The genuinely close spots will still require thought. But the obviously good calls and the obviously bad ones will start announcing themselves before you've fully processed them consciously. That's what consistent practice builds. The mental framework itself is simple. Every call you consider has a price. That price creates a threshold. Your hand either clears that threshold or it doesn't. Your job is to know which side of the line you're on and act accordingly. Not every hand, not every session, but over enough decisions. That habit of checking the math is one of the things that separates players who grow at the game from players who stay stuck. The pot is always telling you something about what it would take to make a call worthwhile. Learning to listen to that carefully and matching it against an honest read of your own hand's chances is one of the more reliable ways to keep your decisions pointed in the right direction. Chapter 6: Bluffing and Deception. You've been making decisions based on math up to this point. Pot odds, calling frequencies, what the numbers say you should do. That foundation matters. But there's another layer to this game that lives just underneath all of it, and it has to do with making your opponent believe something that isn't true. That's what a bluff is. You're betting or raising with a hand that probably can't win if your opponent calls and shows down. The goal isn't to win at showdown. The goal is to make them fold before you ever get there. When they fold, you take the pot immediately, and it doesn't matter what you are holding. That right there is the first thing to understand. A bluff wins the pot through the fold, not through hand strength. So in a real sense, you're not playing your cards when you bluff. You're playing your opponent's decision. The psychological weight of that is significant. When you put in a big bet, you're forcing the person across from you to sit with doubt. They have to ask themselves whether you actually have the hand you're representing. That doubt is uncomfortable. It costs them something emotionally, even before it costs them chips. And when doubt builds up over the course of a hand, it can push a player toward the fold button, even when folding might not be the mathematically correct move. Now here's something that shapes your entire approach to this. If you only ever bet when you have a strong hand, thoughtful opponents will figure that out quickly. They'll just stop paying you off. They'll fold every time the bet gets big, and you'll win small pots. But once your opponents know you're capable of bluffing at a reasonable rate, everything changes. Now they have to call you more often, with medium-strength hands, just to keep you honest. That means your value bets get called more. That's where the long-term profit comes from. Bluffing and value betting work together. One makes the other more powerful. For a bluff to hold up, it needs to tell a coherent story. Your betting pattern throughout the hand has to make sense given what you're pretending to hold. If the board comes out with 3 cards that might have connected with the kind of hands you'd play from your position, and you've been betting with confidence from the beginning, that story is easier to sell. But if you suddenly fire a big bet on a board that doesn't fit anything a reasonable player would have in your spot, even a casual opponent might sense that something's off. Board texture matters a lot here. Boards that are coordinated or that carry scare cards can support a bluff in a way that dry boards often can't. If a card comes that represents a flush completing or a straight filling in, and your actions throughout the hand are consistent with having played those kinds of holdings, the story becomes credible. That credibility is what the bluff runs on. Your position at the table shapes how often bluffing is a reasonable option. Acting last gives you a significant advantage because you've already seen what everyone else did before it's your turn. If the checks come around to you on a given street, that's information. It tells you something about the strength of the hands you're up against. Bluffing from late position with that context behind you is a much cleaner spot than firing from early position when you haven't seen anything yet. Early position bluffs carry more risk because you're making a move without knowing how the table is leaning. The number of opponents in the hand also matters. It's a lot harder to get 3 people to fold than it is to get 1. Every additional player in the pot is another person who might call, and the math of getting everyone out becomes increasingly difficult. Clean bluffing opportunities tend to involve fewer opponents, ideally just 1. The more heads up the situation, the more control you have over the story you're telling. Watching how your opponents actually play is something you should be doing every hand, not just the ones you're in. Some players fold frequently. They're selective, they play tight, and they don't like putting chips in the middle without a solid reason. Those are the players who are most likely to get out of the way when a well-timed bluff lands in front of them. Other players call almost everything. They're curious, they're stubborn, or they just don't like being pushed around. Trying to bluff those players tends to be a losing exercise. They'll look you up with middle pair and feel fine about it. Early in a hand, before stacks get deeply committed, players are often more willing to get away from a hand. The later the street, the more they've already put in, and the more attached they tend to feel. That emotional attachment to what's already in the pot can make late street bluffs trickier. It's not impossible, but you need a stronger reason to fire on the river than you might need to take a stab before the flop or on the flop itself. Bet sizing connects directly to how convincing a bluff can be. If the pot is meaningful and you put in a bet that looks like a real value bet, that's the kind of pressure that forces a decision. A small bet often invites a call because the price feels comfortable. Sizing your bluffs in line with how you'd bet your strongest hands makes it harder for opponents to sort out what you're doing. Now flip it around. You're going to face bluffs too, and part of getting better at this game is learning to recognize when someone might be running one on you. The most reliable place to start is betting patterns. When someone bets in a way that doesn't fit how they've played the rest of the hand, that inconsistency is worth noting. A player who checked twice and then suddenly fires a large bet on the river might have just hit something big. Or they might be trying to buy the pot after their draw missed. Context is everything, and you build that context by watching the whole hand, not just the moment the bet lands in front of you. Bet sizing gives you information here too. A bet that feels out of proportion to the situation, either too big or unusually small, can signal that something's off. Players who bluff sometimes oversize to apply maximum pressure, hoping you'll just fold rather than think it through. Others undersize, trying to make the bluff look cheap and safe. Neither of those patterns fits cleanly into how a confident player with a strong hand would typically approach the situation. Physical behavior can carry some weight, though you have to hold this information loosely. Different people respond to stress differently, and what's a tell for one player might mean nothing for another. That said, some general patterns do appear often enough to be worth observing. A sudden shift in posture, like someone sitting up straight or leaning into the table when they make a big bet, can sometimes reflect the manufactured confidence of someone who's bluffing and trying to project strength. Genuine strength often comes with a certain stillness. But again, this varies, and a single physical cue shouldn't drive your decision on its own. What's more useful is combining what you see physically with what you already know about the betting pattern. If someone's story doesn't quite add up mathematically, and their body language shifted in a way that feels performed, that combination carries more weight than either signal alone. You're triangulating rather than guessing, and that's the right way to think about it. Detecting bluffs also requires patience. You can't make a strong read in one hand. You build a picture of how an opponent behaves over time. What's their typical rhythm when they bet? How do they handle the pause before a big decision? Do they look at their chips when a card comes out? Individually, those observations don't mean much. Collectively, they start to fill in the portrait of how this particular person behaves when they have it, versus when they don't. The longer you stay attentive and resist the urge to zone out during hands you're not playing, the more of that information you collect. And when you're finally in a spot where someone fires at you in a suspicious way, you've got something to draw on. Bluffing and catching bluffs both come down to the same underlying discipline. You're paying attention. You're building a read. You're making a judgment that's informed by everything you've observed, not just the card that fell on the river. The math you already know is the baseline. But this part of the game lives in the space between the numbers, in the stories being told, in the hesitations, in the bets that are just slightly too large. That's where the game gets interesting. And the more you slow down and watch, the more of it you'll start to see. Chapter 7. Adjusting to opponents. The first thing you want to do when you sit down at a new table is stop thinking about your own cards for a moment. Just watch. You're looking at how people move, how quickly they act, how often they're reaching for chips before it's even their turn. That information starts building a picture before you've played a single hand together. Over time, players tend to reveal themselves through patterns. Some people play a lot of hands and bet aggressively when they do. Others play fewer hands, but push hard when they enter a pot. Some play wide and call a lot without much pressure behind it. And some just sit back, wait, and don't make many moves at all. These broad tendencies form the categories that most experienced players use to get their footing early in a session. You've got your tight aggressive player, your loose aggressive player, your tight passive player, and your loose passive player. These aren't permanent labels. They're just the first sketch of a much bigger picture. That sketch matters because it gives you a starting point. If someone 3-bets you early, and you've seen them do that twice already in the first orbit, you can factor that in. But you've got to be careful about making hard decisions based on thin samples. One aggressive move doesn't mean someone's a maniac. One fold doesn't mean they're a nit. You need volume. You need to watch someone across many different spots before you start leaning on those reads with confidence. Timing is part of that observation too. The speed at which someone acts can tell you something. A player who snaps off a call without thinking might be reacting on feel rather than analysis. Someone who tanks before making a small bet might be working through something they're unsure of. These aren't guarantees, and timing tells vary a lot from person to person, but they're one more data point to stack alongside everything else you're seeing. The more angles you observe, the better your initial read is going to be. And as the session moves forward, you have to stay open to updating. People adjust. Someone who was playing tight in the first hour might loosen up after winning a big pot. Someone who was splashing chips around might tighten up after taking a bad beat. Your reads need to move with the player, not stay locked onto that early impression you formed. Staying attentive to those shifts is one of the things that separates a disciplined observer from someone who just assumes they've figured a person out and stops paying attention. Once you've built some real observations, you start looking for the specific behaviors that repeat themselves. Not just the category someone fits into, but the exact tendencies that show up hand after hand. You're asking yourself how often this person is opening pots. You're noticing what they do when someone pushes back at them. You're watching whether they fold to pressure or whether they dig in and call. Those recurring behaviors are where the real exploitation lives. Someone who enters a lot of pots but consistently backs down when they face a raise is telling you something useful. They're willing to put chips in, but they're not committed. Against that person, aggression starts to look more profitable. You can take pots away from them more often because they're not defending what they build. Recognizing that pattern changes how you approach every hand you play against them. On the other side, someone who calls almost every bet, but rarely raises, is also giving you information. They're not going to blow you off a hand, but they're also not punishing you for betting too thin. That changes your value range. You can bet a wider range of made hands for value, because they'll call with worse more often. And because they're not raising, your bluffing frequency should probably come down. They're going to see your hand regardless. These adjustments don't have to be dramatic. That's an important point. You're not flipping your whole strategy on its head every time you pick up a new read. You're making small modifications. Maybe you're calling slightly wider in one spot, because you know they bluff a lot. Maybe you're sizing up a little on your value bets, because you know someone on your left is a station. Those incremental shifts accumulate into a meaningful edge over the course of a session, without requiring you to abandon your overall game plan. Big overhauls often introduce errors of their own. Small, targeted adjustments tend to hold up better. New information keeps coming, and you have to keep feeding it into your picture. If someone you pegged as tight starts opening more hands, that's a signal worth noting. If someone who was aggressive earlier has gone quiet, there might be something happening there. Staying curious and observant through the whole session means your adjustments keep improving rather than calcifying around a read that's no longer accurate. Now let's shift the lens to yourself, because all of this observation goes both ways. While you're building reads on your opponents, they're building reads on you. And if you've been playing a predictable style, the sharper players at the table are going to start using it against you. When your betting patterns are too consistent, opponents can respond to your sizing instead of your actual hand. If you always bet big with strong hands and small with weak ones, that's not a bet anymore. It's a signal. You've essentially told the table what you're holding before they even need to read you. Mixing your bet sizes across different hand strength closes that window. A large bet doesn't always mean strength. A small bet doesn't always mean weakness. When your sizing is balanced across your range, opponents have to actually guess rather than just decode. The same idea applies to which hands you take certain actions with. If you only raise before the flop with premium holdings, anyone paying attention will fold everything when you finally put in a 3-bet. That predictability costs you value. You want your aggressive actions to represent a wide enough range that opponents can't just automatically assume where you sit. Occasionally mixing in some less obvious hands when conditions make sense keeps your range harder to pin down. That unpredictability has to serve a purpose, though. There's a version of mixing it up that's just chaos, where you're doing random things that don't fit the situation and you end up confused about your own line. That's not what you're going for. What you want is deliberate variation. You're choosing to take a less conventional line because it makes sense given the players involved, the dynamics at the table, and the strategic goal you have in mind. Randomness without thought just creates holes in your own game. Purposeful variation closes holes in the reads your opponents are trying to build on you. One practical way to think about it is to ask yourself occasionally whether your recent actions have left any obvious fingerprints. If you've 3-bet the last 4 times you played a hand, that pattern is sitting right there for observant players to see. You might want to let one go, or take a different line, not because your hand demands it, but because the pattern itself has become information they can use. Thinking at that level keeps you one step ahead of anyone who's tracking you, as carefully as you're tracking them. Staying balanced and varied also means you don't become exploitable in the spots that hurt the most. If you always fold to aggression on later streets, you'll get run over. If you always call down, you'll get bluffed less, but value bet more. Neither extreme serves you well. The goal is to operate in a range that keeps opponents uncertain, so they can't comfortably push you off hands or lock up easy value against you. The whole process is circular. You're watching them, adjusting to what you see, and at the same time managing what they see when they look at you. It's an ongoing conversation that plays out across every hand, every orbit, and every session. The players who stay ahead in that conversation tend to win more consistently, not because they have perfect reads or flawless strategy, but because they keep adapting. They keep refining. They treat each new piece of information as something useful rather than something to ignore. The table is always giving you data. Your job is to receive it carefully and respond with intention.